The night before Christmas, December 24th, Christmas Eve, the children are ecstatic. Santa Claus is coming for one night a year to bring gifts to the world. During the night at midnight is the Epiphany, or the manifestation of Santa Claus and his reindeer, coming from the North Pole into the heavens and descending during the winter night. But traditionally, there is a task involved here. Families leave milk and cookies by the chimney for Santa Claus, a symbol for good hospitality. The ancient Greeks called this Xenia, hospitality, and from the time of Homer and through the Christian Byzantines, this was always understood as the highest moral obligation, as well as political imperative. The Trojan War, told in Homer's Iliad, started because Paris of Troy broke the rules of hospitality. Paris was a guest of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, but he messed up big time by running off with Menelaus' wife, Helen. This was a huge no-no because hospitality, or Xenia, was sacred and protected by Zeus. Stealing Helen was not just an insult to Menelaus, it was an insult to Zeus himself. So the Greeks, the Achaeans, had to go to war to get revenge and restore honor. Jesus even used Xenia in his parables. Jesus in Luke 14 says, "When you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they are not able to pay you back. God will repay you on the day the good people rise from death." The New Testament authors, writing for a Greek audience, depict Jesus going out of his way to feed 5,000 people with just one loaf of bread and 2 fish, a miracle usually tied to hospitality in some way or another. A theoxania or theoxeny is a xenia or proper hospitality done for a god or gods. In the same sense, theophany is an epiphany or manifestation of a god to humans. And lastly, a Theodosia is when a god or gods bring gifts to humans. These three, theoxeny, theophany, and Theodosia, will be the main themes in this video. This video is sponsored by Ekster wallets. Ekster is known for the first trackable wallet. Check this out. Comes with a trackable card that you keep in your wallet. You might lose your wallet in a restaurant somewhere, or you might even just lose it in your house in a couch, and you can just get on your phone and track it and find it in minutes. I've done it like 6 times already in the 2 months that I've had this. They make grid backpacks, key cases, 7-in-1 tool cards, tech cases, camera cubes, laptop power banks, and even more. Right now during Christmas, they're doing a 50% off deal. However, if you use my code Gnostic, or use my link in the description, you're not only going to help out the channel, but you'll also get 55% off. Using my code or my link in the description, you're helping out the channel, and you're also getting 55% off. Thank you, Ekster wallets. Back to the video. A theoxany is a fancy word for when humans host gods who appear in form or manifest themselves to the world. Quite literally, a theoxany is the celebration of the epiphany of a god, or a feast for a god who appears to humans, usually by sharing a meal with them. In ancient stories, gods often show up at sacrifices or roam the earth in disguise to test people's kindness and morals. A classic example of this is in Homer's Odyssey, where gods walk among mortals to see how they act. Another classic example is the Homeric hymn to Demeter, where Demeter is roaming around the world and is taken in by the people of Eleusis, where she gives them the laws. The idea of a theophany is simple. If people treat gods well, they're rewarded. If they're rude or unwelcoming, they're punished. For example, a bad theophany, the story of Pentheus, who disrespected Dionysus and faced terrible consequences. A good theophany, stories where gods reward their host, like in the tale of Baucis and Philemon, an old couple who kindly hosted Jupiter and Mercury in disguise. Or in the case of the Epiphany feast, during the winter solstice, Dionysus appears and brings wine and gifts and makes the people cheerful and merry. Sometimes the host becomes so important in these myths that they're turned into a hero and worshipped, often as the first priest of a new cult or someone who introduces a new skill like winemaking. The festival of Theoxenia was a specific kind of worship where a banquet was prepared for the gods with food set out on the table and a couch for them. Unlike regular sacrifices where humans and gods had separate portions, this meal was shared between the worshippers and the divine guest. The Theoxeny at Delphi is a famous example which brought people and gods together, with Apollo and Dionysus as the star guest. A similar ritual in Rome was the Lex Cisternium, influenced by these Greek customs. Both the traditional cults that we call pagans and Christians in the Greco-Roman world put Xenia, or hospitality, as the highest moral obligation. Even deep into the Renaissance period, Xenia was still a custom that was taken to the utmost seriousness, especially during the holiday season. The origin of the famous Xenia tradition for Santa Claus, the obligation to leave milk and cookies for Santa or Saint Nick, is hard to track down, as it seems to have been widespread pretty early, even as far back as the 6th and 7th century. What we do know for sure is that St. Nicholas's feast was held on the 6th of December and started out as a local tradition of Myra in Phrygia, modern-day southern Turkey, as well as in Nicaea and Constantinople, and then spread to other cities over time until it became a widespread Christian tradition and feast in the 9th century, as the sources show it being observed by Charlemagne in France. This Theophany tradition had a symbiotic relationship with the Theodosia, or God's gifts tradition, in which Santa Claus returns the favor of milk and cookies, with gifts under the Christmas tree or stockings hanging over the chimney entrance. And it wasn't always necessarily just milk and cookies, but some level of hospitality was observed in all traditions. In some countries, Santa is left different treats. United Kingdom, mince pies and a glass of sherry or brandy. In Australia, beer and cookies. In Sweden, rice pudding. In Germany, a letter to Santa, and sometimes food for his reindeer. In pre-Christian Scandinavia, during Yule, children would leave food for Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, in hopes that Odin would stop by and leave gifts in return. This practice of offering food to supernatural figures influenced later Christmas traditions. Dutch settlers brought the tradition of Sinterklaas to America, where children left treats for Sinterklaas's horse. This evolved into leaving treats for Santa Claus as the modern figure developed in the United States. The modern version of leaving milk and cookies became popular in the United States during the Great Depression. Parents encouraged this practice as a way to teach children the importance of generosity, even during hard times. By leaving food for Santa, children symbolically shared what little they had with others. The 20th century saw an increase in the commercialization of Christmas, with advertising campaigns promoting the idea of Santa enjoying milk and cookies. By the mid-20th century, it had become a widely accepted custom, especially in the United States. Different local traditions seem to be co-opted and grafted into the widespread tradition over time, and they manifest in different ways. The tradition of Santa Claus goes back to the historical Saint Nicholas, a 4th century Christian bishop of Myra in Phrygia, who on one hand is known for slapping Bishop Arius, the founder of Arianism, at the Council of Nicaea, and on the other hand, no pun intended, is known for his generosity. On St. Nicholas Day, back in medieval Byzantium, December 6th, children left out food and treats, often in shoes, hoping to receive small gifts in return. The legends about St. Nicholas's gift-giving come from several sources that date to centuries after St. Nicholas lived in the 4th century. The oldest legends about St. Nicholas say nothing about gift-giving, and instead depict St. Nick as a protector of sailors, with tales about him saving ships at sea, where he miraculously calms the storms and saves sailors from drowning. These 5th century legends about St. Nicholas have nothing to do with gift-giving, but show St. Nicholas as a wonder-working savior. In the 6th century, another legend about St. Nicholas was circulating. This story explains how 3 innocent men were wrongly condemned to death by an unjust ruler named Eustathius. Nicholas rushed to their execution just in time to stop the executioner from putting the 3 men to death, and forgave them for their sins. Once again, no gift-giving, which then leads me to the only logical conclusion, that the spirit of gift-giving during the month of December has to come from somewhere else. The primary sources we have about St. Nicholas: Encomium of St. Nicholas by Andrew of Crete, 8th century Greek text; The Life of St. Nicholas by Michael the Archimandrite, 9th century also Greek text, as well as Latin hagiographies, Gesta Sancti Nicholai, 10th century Latin. These 3 sources show examples of St. Nicholas's generosity and charity. By the time these primary sources are written, in the 8th to 10th centuries, December 6th had already become an observed feast date in the Christian tradition, and December was a time that was traditionally the season for gift-giving, going way back to Roman Saturnalia, and even beyond that, to the Greek Haloa and Lenaia winter festivals. During the Saturnalia, when the rest of my household are enjoying the festive season, I allow myself to relax as well. Pliny the Elder. Martial, a 1st century epigram writer, shows how festive this time was even before Christmas was invented. These trifles are suited to the festive season of Saturn. Accept them in good part, and may December pass pleasantly. If you give me a gift for Saturnalia, let it be something I can use, not something that will decorate my home and gather dust. Now is the time for cheerful giving and jest. Let slaves dine with their masters, and let the festive couch bear none but the free. Come and join our cheerful feast, where no one is too rich or too poor, and all drink from the same cup. And some primary sources show us that December itself became a time of festivity, even outside of the days dedicated to Saturn. Seneca writes, "It is now the month of December, when the whole city is in a bustle. Licenses are allowed in public. Everywhere there is a great noise of preparations, as if there were some real difference between the days devoted to Saturn and those for working. December and Saturnalia can even be synonymous in some sources. Now in December it is permitted to give delightful gifts with an open hand. And now you can speak what you wish. The time has come." These primary sources highlight how December became a festive season of its own, regardless of Saturnalia, the winter solstice, or the new year. December had become a special month of gift-giving and merrymaking, and that never changes even to this very day. The mere chance of St. Nicholas getting a feast date in early December is most likely how he became tied to gift-giving and merrymaking. As we have already demonstrated, this month was special to those rites. St. Nicholas had become a celebrity saint in not only Greek churches, Hagios Nikolaos, but also Syrian, who call him Baba Noel, or in Coptic in the Egyptian churches, Papa Noel. In Latin churches, Sanctus Nicolaus, which later gets brought into the Dutch tradition as Sinterklaas, then Santa Claus. His tradition stretching far and wide across the Byzantine Roman Empire and beyond. For 5 centuries, the St. Nicholas legends stretched from the Byzantine Greek East and the Gothic Latin West, highlighting how far and wide these legends traveled, and give some context as to why St. Nicholas became such a legend in Christian culture. In all of these stories, the oldest version to the latest versions, St. Nick is depicted as a man of empathy who gives bags of coins to the poor, saves women from a life of prostitution and despair, feeds children, and even one of the later 9th century legends says that he threw a bag of money into a house of a poor person's home during the night and never took credit for his generosity, possibly the origin of the tradition where Santa Claus comes in the night while everyone is sleeping and comes through the chimney. But something else about the St. Nicholas story that stands out to me more than gift-giving, something we already discussed, which is the Xenia, or hospitality tradition, of leaving milk and cookies out for Santa Claus. This is a classic example of a theophany, when a god appears to humans with blessings and gifts and is given proper hospitality in return. Even though St. Nicholas is not a god, he is depicted as supernatural, and his Christmas tradition checks all the boxes of a standard annual Theophany-Theoxeny-Theodosia festival. These very Theophany-Theoxeny-Theodosia festivals we can find all throughout the ancient Greek pagan traditions. During the eve of the feast of St. Nicholas on December 6th, it was a custom for children of the household to leave food and drink for St. Nick, and if they did so, St. Nick would leave a small present for the children. We see similar traditions for this for the gods of ancient Greece. When proper hospitality is given, they grant wishes or bring blessings to the host. A prime example that I've already mentioned, Philemon and Baucis, when God the Father Jupiter and his son and Logos, Mercury, appear in a Phrygian town in human form, which is an epiphany or theophany in the most classic sense of the word. They are given good hospitality, theoxany, by Philemon and Baucis, who give them their last bottle of wine and the last of the bread they had. During the meal, Philemon and Baucis noticed that the wine jug remained full no matter how much was poured, even though it was their last bottle, revealing their guest's divine nature. The wine miracle is typical for epiphanies, as I will demonstrate. As a result of the good hospitality by Philemon and Baucis, Jupiter and his angelic Logos son Mercury grant them any wish they desire, and they wish that their old home could become a brand new temple, so they could become the temple's guardians and die at the same moment, so they would never live without each other. Their wish was granted. When their time came, Philemon and Baucis were transformed into intertwined trees, an oak tree, Jupiter's tree, and an elm tree, Mercury's tree, standing side by side as a symbol for Philemon's and Baucis's eternal love and devotion. Ovid goes on to say, "I saw the trees myself, wreaths and the boughs, and hung a fresh one on there, An image of decorating with wreaths and greenery ends the story. The myth does not explicitly relate what time of the year it is. However, we can infer that this is midwinter, given the gods' need to seek shelter and warmth. And while the rest of the town rejected the gods, Philemon and Baucis welcomed them with warmth. The text also relates that the hearth fire was being relit, ash still warm, and fanned yesterday's embers, and coaxed a flame rug was spread out. With her old breath, Baucis broke dry twigs and lit a new fire for the night for the gods to recline by. A beechwood bowl hung by its curving handle from a peg. They fill it with their heated water, and the guests bathe in the welcome balm their weary feet. They place a soft river sedge mattress upon a couch and spread on it their drapes. Only brought out on holy days, the gods reclined. This is clearly a Brumalia, midwinter myth about a Theophany, Theoxeny, and Theodosia, which are the three major aspects of the Christmas Epiphany season. The three aspects that stand out in this story. Number 1, Theophany, Epiphany of the gods. Jupiter and Mercury appear in human form. Number 2, Theoxeny, Theoxenia for the gods Jupiter and Mercury. They're given good hospitality. Number 3, Theodosia, gift giving by the gods. Jupiter and Mercury grant blessings and wishes. The St. Nicholas Santa Claus tradition checks the same boxes. 1, Theophany, Epiphany of Santa Claus during Christmas Eve. 2, Theoxeny, hospitality in the form of milk and cookies is given to Santa Claus. Number 3, Theodosia, Santa brings gifts to the children and brings cheer and merriment. This tradition of St. Nicholas Day was obviously co-opted into the Christmas tradition. The tradition of St. Nicholas Day on December 6th gradually merged with Christmas celebrations on December 25th over several centuries. This shift was influenced by cultural, religious, and regional factors, particularly in Western Europe and later North America. There is no specific time when this shift took place, and it seems to have been a slow and gradual move from the 12th to 16th centuries. During the Middle Ages, St. Nicholas's role as a gift giver on his feast day became widespread in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, Germany, and other regions. In parallel, Christmas celebrations began incorporating elements of feasting, gift-giving, and merrymaking, influenced by earlier pagan winter festivals like Saturnalia. Saturnalia, which took place in ancient Rome, as Livy mentions that Saturnalia was formalized after the defeat of the Romans by the Carthaginian general Hannibal at the Battle of Lake Trasimene around 217 BCE, and was a yearly week festival leading up to the winter solstice and the New Year's Calends of Januarius from 217 BCE until the mid-5th century CE, and morphed into a secular Brumalia time, which molded into the Christmas season. But Saturnalia was by no means the originator of this midwinter tradition. Let's take a look at ancient classical Greece, specifically Attica, Boeotia, Corinthia, Elis, Phocis, and the Cyclades Islands, and Ionia, modern-day Turkey. These 8 major districts of ancient Hellas include the cities of Athens, Eleusis, Thebes, Delphi, Corinth, Olympia, Mount Helicon, as well as the islands of Naxos, Andros, and the city of Teos in Ionia, Asia Minor. What these places have in common is that they celebrated the winter solstice by honoring the Epiphany, or manifestation, or birth of Dionysus, the same time of the year as the Epiphany and birth of Christ. Back in the classical period of ancient Athens and the city of Delphi, the Lenaia was a midwinter festival occurring just after the winter solstice, corresponding to our January, and in the city of Eleusis, the Haloa was celebrated during the winter solstice, corresponding to our late December until early January. Citizens of Attica could potentially attend both of these festivals, given how close Eleusis is to Athens, just 9 miles away. Elis celebrated the rural Dionysia, also later called Thuia by Pausanias in the 2nd century, which was the major Dionysian Mid-Winter festival, celebrated all through Attica in different ways by different cities. The major cities between Attica and Elis would march in pomp procession with the image of Dionysus into local theaters. Following the pomp, the theater of Dionysus was purified by the sacrifice of a bull, which represented the death and rebirth of the god Dionysus. The new child, Zagreus, who is born premature but must be sewn back into the thigh of Zeus to be born again in the early spring at the city Dionysia. Both festivals were tied together by myth, just like Christmas is tied to Easter in Christianity by the Gospels. This myth of the premature birth at the winter solstice has precedent in Egyptian lore. Horus was also described as being born at the winter solstice premature, and also those who say that Osiris is being buried at the time when the grain is sown and covered in the earth, and that he comes to life and reappears when the plants begin to sprout. For this reason also it is said that Isis, when she perceived that she was pregnant, put upon herself an amulet, and on the 6th day of the month of Theophany, about the time of the winter solstice, she gave birth to Harpocrates, Horus the child, imperfect and premature, amid the early flowers and shoots. For this reason, they bring to him an offering the first fruits of the growing lentils, and the days of his birth they celebrate after the spring equinox. Just like the rural and city Dionysia are tied to each other in the midst of Dionysus, the birth of Horus at the winter solstice, premature, is tied to his rebirth at the spring equinox, which is at the time when Osiris is slain by Set, just 3 days after the full moon that follows the spring equinox, according to Plutarch. It was constructed this way so that Horus the child represents the resurrected slain Osiris, the son avenging the father. And this was represented by the pharaohs of Egypt, who were called Horus while they lived and Osiris while they were dead. The pharaoh who succeeded his father was said to be the living soul of his ancestral seat. A 7-month premature birth of Dionysus and Horus is also told about Osiris. Cadmus was a citizen of Egyptian Thebes, begot several children. Of one who was Semele, she was violated by an unknown person, became pregnant, and after 7 months, she gave birth to a child whose appearance was such as the Egyptians hold to be Osiris. Now, such a child is not usually brought into the world alive, either because it is contrary to the will of the gods, or because the law of nature does not admit of it. But when Cadmus found out what had taken place, having at the same time a reply from an oracle commanding him to observe the laws of his fathers, he both gilded the infant and paid it the appropriate sacrifices on the grounds that there had been a sort of epiphany, there's the word epiphany, of Osiris among men. Fatherhood of the child he attributed to Zeus, in this way magnifying Osiris and averting slander from his violated daughter. And this reason is why the tale was given out among the Greeks to the effect that Semele, the daughter of Cadmus, was the mother of Osiris by Zeus. The word epiphany is also used here by Diodorus, along with the 7-month premature birth. And what is striking about this passage is that Osiris's mother here is Semele, the traditional mother of Dionysus. It's at this time of the video that I would like to ask you, the audience, to keep a mental note of this 7-month birth of Osiris and Dionysus and being called an Epiphany. 7-month Epiphany. Because it will come up later, not long, in regards to an early Christian tradition that has been forgotten. When it comes to Dionysus and Osiris being used interchangeably by Diodorus and Plutarch, anyone immersed in the classics should not be surprised, due to ancient authors since the time of Herodotus down to the Neoplatonists of late antiquity, equating Dionysus with Osiris. But Horus the child, being born premature and torn apart by titans like Dionysus or Zagreus, is a Hellenistic period invention, highlighting that Osiris and Horus are one dyad, just as Dionysus and Zagreus are one dyad. Plutarch puts this into context. Moreover, the Greeks are wont to consecrate the ivy to Dionysus, and it is said that among the Egyptians, the name for ivy is Kinosiris, meaning plant of Osiris. I leave out the account of Menaces' annexation of Dionysus, Osiris, and Serapis to Epaphus, as well as Anticletus' statement that Isis was a daughter of Prometheus and was wedded to Dionysus. Plutarch explains that Dionysus, Osiris, Horus, and Serapis are all annexed into a god called Epaphus, which is a classic example of what scholars call a theocracia, a blending or synchronization of multiple gods into one god. Epaphus, the god that they're all annexed to, is an enticing god, considering his only myth that we have is regarding his birth by the goddess Io, who was also equated with Isis by Apollodorus in 100 BCE. And the story of the birth of Epaphus was that Zeus laid hands on the virgin Isis, and she gave birth to Epaphus in a cave. A virgin birth with no sexual union whatsoever. Just Zeus touching the womb of Io, and she gives birth to the divine child, Epaphus. Macrobius, in his Saturnalia, would include more deities into his theocracia: Attis, Dionysus, Adonis, Apollo, and Mithras. He even calls this deity Iao. Orpheus explicitly declares that the son Apollo is the same as the god Liber, Dionysus, in this verse, the son whom they call with surname Dionysus. And while that verse is more unambiguous, this one, by the same poet, is more elaborate. Zeus is one, Hades is one, Apollo is one, Dionysus is one. The authority of that verse is based on an oracle of Apollo of Claros, in which another name is also given to the sun, who in these same sacred verses is called, among other things, Iao. For when Apollo of Claros was asked concerning the god called Iao, which of the gods he should be considered, Apollo replied as follows: "Those who know the mysteries should conceal things not to be sought. But if your understanding is slight, your mind feeble, say that the greatest god of all is Iao, Hades in winter, Zeus at the start of spring, Apollo in summer, and delicate Iacchos, Dionysus in the fall." Cornelius Labeo sought out this oracle's meaning, developing an interpretation of this godhead and his name that identifies Pater Liber, Dionysus, and the son, Sol, as Iao, in his book titled On the Oracle of Apollo of Claros. Macrobius goes on to say that this deity was born at the winter solstice, Apollo, the ivy-crowned, the Bacchic seer. But given the earlier proof that Apollo and the sun are the same, and the subsequent demonstration that Dionysus is the very same as Apollo, there can be no doubt that Sol and Dionysus must be considered aspects of the same Godhead. Yet the point will be proved to perfection by the following, still more transparent arguments. They observe holy mysteries in the rites by calling the sun Apollo when it is in the upper, that is the daytime hemisphere. When it is in the lower, that is nighttime hemisphere, it is considered Dionysus, who is Liber. Similarly, some images of Dionysus are fashioned in the form of a boy, others as a young man, sometimes also bearded or even elderly. The different ages are to be understood in reference to Sol. It is very small at the winter solstice, like the image the Egyptians bring out from its shrine on a fixed date, with an appearance of a small infant, since the winter solstice is the shortest day. Macrobius is citing the birth of Aion here, along with Sol Invictus, and Alexandrians bring out an image of a divine child during the winter solstice. He says that Dionysus Apollo, who he syncs together in his Theocracia, are born at the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, in which they are depicted as an infant child. Then, as the days become progressively longer by the vernal equinox, it resembles a vigorous young man and is given the form of a youth. Later, full maturity at the summer solstice is represented by a beard, by which point it has grown as much as it will grow. Thereafter, as the days become even shorter, the god is rendered in the fourth shape, like a man growing old. Similarly, we learn that in Thrace, Apollo and Dionysus are considered the same. They call him Sabazius and worship him in a splendid ritual, Macrobius, Saturnalia. The Chaldean oracles from the 2nd century by Julian the Chaldean calls Dionysus Yao and equates him with Yahweh of the Hebrews. The Chaldeans call the god Dionysus or Bacchus Yao in the Phoenician tongue instead of the intelligible light, but he is often called Sabaoth, signifying that he is above the 7 poles, that is, the Demiurgus. Another related figure to Yao mentioned indirectly is eternity, Eidios, in the Chaldean oracles, and directly in Greek, magical papyri called Aion. For eternity is the cause of never-failing life, of unwearied power, and of unshaken energy, Chaldean oracles. This idea of Aion as the supreme Theocracia godhead, like Yao, fits well with Poimandres' description of the Demiurge, creator of the universe, as connected to the divine logos, a kind of universal reason or word. In the Corpus Hermeticum, sections 1, 4 through 11, it also matches Poimandres' chapter 11 statement. Aion creates the cosmos, that the cosmos is Aion's work, and that Aion brings order. It seems pretty clear that Aion can be seen as another way of describing the demiurge and the cosmic logos united into one dyad godhead, a supreme being like Macrobius' Yao or the Christian triune godhead. It is my opinion that this theocracia of Dionysus with Osiris into Yao is what leads to the inspiration behind not only the god Aion, but also Jesus Christ of the Gospels, who is not the Jesus of history, if there is one. Aion was a 2nd century Eastern Roman god, venerated in Antioch, Syria, and Alexandria, Egypt, in the same centers where early Christianity thrives in the 1st and 2nd century. He is also born of a virgin at the winter solstice. Epiphanius, in his Panarion, mentions Aion in passing when discussing the various traditions and dates for the Epiphany and birth of Jesus Christ. Christ was born 8 days before the calends of January, 13 days after the winter solstice, and the addition of light and day. This day is celebrated by the Greeks, the idolaters, on the 8th before the calends of January, which the Romans call Saturnalia, the Egyptians call Chronia, and the Alexandrians Caeclia. Thus was ordained the coming of our Lord Christ, the birth according to the flesh, or rather, the perfect incarnation, which is called Epiphany, from the beginning of increase of light, for a span of 13 days. For this also had to become a type of our Lord Jesus Christ and his 12 disciples, fulfilling the number of 13 days of light's increase. In many places, a great festival on that very night of the Epiphany, so that those hoping in the deception would not seek the truth. First, in Alexandria, in the so-called Choreum, there is a great temple, that is, the precinct of Chori, for staying awake the entire night with certain songs and flutes, singing to the idol, and spending the whole night. After the crowing of roosters, they descend with torches into a certain underground shrine and bring out a certain wooden statue, seated on a litter, naked, having a golden seal of a cross on the forehead, and 2 other seals on each hand, and another 2 on the 2 knees, together with 5 seals made of gold. And they carry this statue around the middle temple 7 times, with flutes and drums and hymns. And after celebrating, they again bring it down to the underground place. Being asked what this mystery is, they reply and say that at this hour today, the Chori, that is the Virgin, gave birth to Aion. For those who don't know, Aion is a 2nd century Antioch Syrian and Alexandrian Egyptian syncretic deity between Osiris and Dionysus, reborn annually at the solstice. Professor Jarl Fossum explains in The Myth of the Eternal Rebirth that this theocracia of several deities of vegetation and rebirth, including Attis, Adonis, as well as Osiris and Dionysus. Epiphanius goes on to finish with this. This also happens in Petra, the city, the metropolis of Arabia, which is Edom, written in the scriptures, in the idol temple there. And they praise the Virgin in Arabic dialect, calling her in Arabic Kabu, that is, Chori or Virgin, and the one born from her, Dusares, that is, the only begotten of the Lord. This also takes place in Elusa, the city, on that night, as they're in Petra in Alexandria. Elusa is a city in Israel. Dusares is another deity from Arabia who was identified with Dionysus and had a temple in southern Italy. These different traditions, whether it be Sabazius, Liber Pater, Dionysus, Aion, Zalmoxis, Dusares, Iao, or Iacchus, seem to be Bacchic traditions from around the ancient world in different cities and cults. The fact that Epiphanius mentions 3 cities shows that this was a widespread tradition that went down during the winter holiday season, relating to the Theophany or Epiphany of Dionysus. Another striking detail of this passage by Epiphanius is the 12 days of Christmas theme that he says is due to the 12 disciples. And these days connect December 25th, once again, which was the winter solstice during the time of the Julian calendar, to January 6th, the Epiphany date. January 6th is one of the oldest dates observed by Christians on record for the Epiphany of Christ, going back to Basilides, a Christian heretic who lived in the 1st century and was taught by Simon Magus in Antioch, then moved to Alexandria in 117 to teach as a leader of the church. But the followers of Basilides celebrate the day of his baptism too, as a festival of his day, spending the previous night in readings, and they say that it was the 15th of the month of Tybi of the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, and some say that it was observed in the 11th of the same month, January 5th to January 6th. It turns out that the Basilidians' central gospel was the Gospel of John, and in this gospel, the baptism is the Epiphany. The time when Jesus was begotten by God was at his baptism. John's gospel does not have a birth scene, so the Basilidians did not celebrate his birth in the physical flesh as his Epiphany, but his baptism is the Epiphany, the spiritual birth, in John chapter 1, along with the wedding at Cana miracle that happens just after Jesus' baptism in John chapter 2. The baptism of Jesus in John 1 represents Christ's Epiphany, in contrast to Luke and Matthew's birth epiphany. Hippolytus describes Basilides as being a Docetist, who believed that Christ was a spirit who was present since the beginning of time, which is also in line with John 1 Logos being a beginning with God, and goes on to say that Christ took on a physical body for a period of time, but then ascended back to the Father. A physical birth was just not important or relevant to the doctrine of Basilides. The baptism was the birth and epiphany. Even church tradition to this day commemorates the baptism, the epiphany, and the wedding at Cana on the same day, on January 6th, where Coptic, Armenian, and Syrian churches to this day still celebrate Christmas on. Hippolytus, against heresy, says, and that each thing, says Basilides, has its own particular times. The Savior is a sufficient witness when he observes, mine hour is not yet come. John 2:4. This, according to the Basilidians, he who has been conceived as the inner spiritual man in what is natural, now this is the sonship which left there the soul. Not that it may be mortal, but that it might abide here according to nature, just as the first sonship left above in its proper locality the Holy Spirit, that is the Spirit, which is conterminous. This I say, he who has been conceived as the inner spiritual man, and has then been arrayed in his own peculiar soul. If we presuppose all four Gospels as canonical and unified, then we might see why this is heretical. However, if we imagine ourselves as early 2nd century Christians in Alexandria, Egypt, who only have the Gospel of John in our church, then all of this fits perfectly with a spiritual baptism as a replacement for a physical flesh birth. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John 1. Then John gave his testimony. I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him. And I myself did not know him, but the one who sent me to baptize with water told me, the man on whom you see the Spirit come down and remain is the one who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. I have seen and I testify that this is God's chosen one. This means that January 6th has nothing to do with any calculations done by Christians in the 3rd century, and the calculation theory put forth by Nothaft and Schmidt can only be applied to December 25th before Aurelian's feast day, and not January 6th, and that any claim that the Christmas tradition has no influence by quote-unquote pagan local traditions is just not honest. or supported by the data. The evidence for local pagan traditions influence the Christmas Epiphany is overwhelming, as I will demonstrate right now. Clement of Alexandria, around the year 198, before Hippolytus or anyone possibly calculated the date of December 25th for the birth of Christ, says that Basilides, who lived an entire century prior to him, around 50 CE to 138 CE, celebrated Christ's baptism as an Epiphany festival on the night of January 5th, called the Nones of January, into the 6th. This is the same night that Pliny the Elder assigns to a Theodosia festival on the island of Andros for Dionysus. Pliny the Elder writes in the 1st century, it is accredited that Mucianus, who was 3 times consul, that the water flowing from a spring in the temple of Dionysus, Father Liber, on the island of Andros, always has the flavor of wine on the Nones of January, January 5th. The day is called Theodosia, God's gift day. Here we not only have an Epiphany feast called Theodosia, with another spring of water being transformed into wine, but it happens on the night of January 5th, the exact same day that Basilides and the earliest Christians observed the Epiphany for Christ, in which Clement explains that they stayed up the night prior in readings, which would have taken place just decades after Pliny wrote this. And Pliny says that this festival was 1 week long, lasting to January 11th. And the Eastern Orthodox tradition has to this very day what is known as the Epiphany tide, or Epiphany season, which takes place between the night of January 5th until the 13th, showing a close proximity of these two festivals being roughly a week long. Pliny says this happens on the island of Andros in the Cyclades. That starts also on the night of January 5th, the Nones of January, through the 11th. Now remember when I asked you to remember Diodorus of Count. Now this is the time in the video where I remind you that you were supposed to remember something. 7-month premature birth and calling it an epiphany. Well, here it is. There's another passage in Epiphanius that talks about this January 5th through 6th Epiphany feast, with some shocking details assigned to it. Epiphanius writes, "For I have also found it written somewhere in these works that the Word of God was born about the 40th year of Augustus. Those who have given a date for the conception and Gabriel's bringing of the tidings to the Virgin, certain persons who have it by tradition that Christ was born after a term of 7 months. And they mention about the 11th of Tybi, the 8th before the Ides of January, January 6th, when in fact the Epiphany came and Christ was born." And there you heard it. In this tradition reported by Epiphanius, not only does he use the word epiphany to describe the birth of Christ on January 6th, like Osiris Dionysus, but Christ is also born after a term of 7 months, premature, like Osiris, the son of Semele, and Diodorus' account. But there's more. Even to this day, Coptic, Syrian, Armenian, and Greek Orthodox churches, January 6th is not only the day of Christ's Epiphany and birth, but it is also the day that the church commemorates the wedding at Cana, the wine miracle with Dionysian undertones. And if you think me calling it Dionysian undertones is a stretch, check this out. So if you should find this in marginal gloss somewhere, do not be misled by the information. The actual date of Christ's birth is in fact the 11th of Tybi, January 6th. It has been shown by every means that the Lord's birth in the flesh took place on the 11th of the month of Egyptian Tybi, January 6th. And the first miracle in Cana of Galilee, when the water was made wine, was performed on about the same 11th day 30 years later. And even to this day, this happens in many places as a testimony to unbelievers because of the miracle which was wrought at that time. As streams and rivers and many localities testify by being changed to wine, a stream at Kibiri, the chief city in Caria, bears witness at the same time of day at which the servants drew the water, and Christ said, "Give it to the governor of the feast." And the stream at Gerasa in Arabia testifies in the same way. I have drunk from the one at Kibiri myself, and my brethren have drunk from the stream in the martyrium at Gerasa. And in Egypt too, many give this testimony of the Nile. Thus, in Egypt itself, and in many countries, everyone draws water on the 11th of the month of Tybi, January 6th, and stores up wine. So not only do we have a matching Epiphany tradition about Christ and Osiris Dionysus being born after a 7-month term, premature, on January 6th, but both are accompanied with wine miracles, but not jars of water being turned into wine at the wedding at Cana. Here, it is specifically streams of water being turned into wine, which is exactly how the Dionysian Epiphany feast are described in 5 primary sources that predate the Gospel of John. Diodorus, in the same book that discusses Osiris being born after a 7-month birth, relates a similar wine miracle Epiphany tradition for the birth of Dionysus, for the people of Naxos, Teos, Elos, and Eleutherae. These are not only very extremely specific details, streams of water turning into wine, 7-month premature births, which are oddly specific, but the date even lines up. Same day of the year, January 6th. To further strengthen my claim that January 6th, the oldest Epiphany of Christ date, was inspired by pagan local Greek traditions, we have to go back to the remaining Dionysian Mid-Winter Epiphany feast that are described in the primary sources as having wine miracles involved, with the Theophany-Theoxeny-Theodosia motif. Naxos, Andros, Teos, and Thebes celebrated the Theodosia, or Epiphany of Dionysus, for 1 week, which started on the night of January 5th through the 6th until the 11th of January, which corresponds to the dates listed by Clement in regards to Basilides' early Epiphany feast. There are 7 different primary sources for this that have been pointed out by Ana Jiménez Cristóbal in this peer-reviewed article, The Epiphany of Dionysus and Elis and the Miracle of Wine. This was a celebration of the coming of Dionysus to the world, his epiphany, and the gifts he would bring mankind, which every year streams of water gush forth and change miraculously into wine. A gift-giving, birth of God festival with a wine miracle. Theophany, Theoxeny, Theodosia, the 3 major motifs from the beginning of the video that Santa Claus, as well as Philemon and Baucis, have in common. Early Christians, as well as Christians to this very day, celebrate the Epiphany, birth of Christ, and wedding at Cana at this exact day, the night of January 5th into the 6th. This is known as the Blessing of Waters. The Orthodox Church performs the Great Blessing of Waters on Theophany, done twice, once on the eve of the feast, January 5th, the night, usually at a baptismal font inside the church, and then again on the day of the feast, January 6th, outdoors at a body of water. Following the divine liturgy, clergy and people go into the crucession, a procession with the cross, to the nearest body of water, similar to how Epiphanius describes the heretics in Alexandria doing a procession of an idol with crosses on his hands and feet, carried out of a chamber. The water blessed on this day is often called Theophany water, but people usually just call it holy water. The faithful take it home as a gift or a blessing by Christ and give it to others as a gift, Theodosia. They sprinkle it on themselves, their homes, and even drink it while praying. The Orthodox Church teaches that holy water is different from regular water because the blessings changes its nature, making it special and incorruptible, just as Dionysus changes the nature of the streams at his temples in Naxos, Andros, Teos, and Elis. This belief dates back as far as even St. John of Chrysostom in the 4th century, who spoke about this miracle just around the time when Epiphanius talks about wine miracles taking place in Caria. Why is not that day on which the Lord was born considered Theophany, but rather this day on which he was baptized? This present day it is on which he was baptized and sanctified the nature of water, because on this day all, having obtained the waters, do carry it home and keep it all year, since today the waters are sanctified and an obvious phenomena occurs. These waters in their essence do not spoil with the passage of time, but obtain today for 1 whole year, and often for 2 or 3 years they remain unharmed and fresh, and afterwards for a long time do not stop being water, just as the obtained from fountains. Why then is this day called Theophany? Because Christ made himself known to all, not then when he was born, but when he was baptized. For the Dionysian cult, the water miraculously turns to blessed wine during the Theophany for Dionysus, and for Christians, the water miraculously becomes holy water and is purified for the Theophany of Christ. One of the primary sources does in fact has a baptism of Dionysus in water that changes its form to wine. At the spring called Kisusa, here, as the story goes, nurses baptized the infant Dionysus after his birth. For the water has the color and sparkle of wine, is clear, and very pleasant to the taste. Theophany baptism that has water being transformed into wine. But this tradition is much deeper and well-sourced, going back before the Gospels. Now these accounts of the birth of Dionysus are generally agreed upon by ancient writers, but rival claims are raised by not a few Greek cities to having been the place of his birth. The peoples at Elis and Naxos, for instance, and the inhabitants of Eleutherae and Teos, and several other peoples state that he was born in their cities. The Teans advance as proof that the god was born among them from the fact that even to this day, at fixed times in their city, a fountain of water turns into wine of unusually sweet fragrance, flows of its own accord from the earth during the reign of Nero in the mid-1st century. Seneca also mentions the island of Naxos, Dionysus' Epiphany tradition. But in this particular source, Dionysus performs a water-to-wine miracle while attending a wedding with his stepmother, similar to Jesus in John 2. Argos paid homage to Bacchus in his stepmother's presence. Naxos, ringed by the Aegean Sea, gave in marriage a deserted maiden, requiting her loss with a better husband. From its dry pumice flowed Nactilian liquor. Chattering streams cut through the grass. The earth drank deep of the sweet fluids. White springs of snowy milk and lesbian wine blended with scented thyme. The new bride was escorted to the vast heavens. Phobos, with hair flowing down to his shoulders, sang the ceremonial hymn, while twin cupids swung their torches. Jove laid aside his fiery weapon and abhorred the thunderbolt at Bacchus's coming. Bacchus coming is the phrase signifying his epiphany. These are just 4 of many of the primary sources that cite these midwinter Theophany feasts for the birth of Dionysus. Besides the Theodosia, the rural Dionysia, there is the Lenaia and Haloa festivals that also take place in the month of Poseidon, which corresponds to December 15th to January 15th, with the winter solstice and January 6th, 12 days falling smack dab in the middle of this ancient festive month. And the Lenaia, which took place both in Athens and Delphi, Dionysus' Epiphany was also celebrated, but the sources have a slightly different account than wine miracles that we get for the Theodosia. The Lenaia festival included special ceremonies for women involving calling on the divine child Bacchus, who is seen as a young version of Dionysus, using torches and going into a subterranean chamber, a theme common among these festivals. The festival also remembered the story of Dionysus' death and rebirth. Similar rituals happened in both Delphi and Athens during the Lenaia, which was celebrated in the winter solstice season, as was the Haloa, celebrated in late December, early January in the city of Eleusis. We can piece together scenes from the Lenaia and Haloa by looking at the many vases dug up at Eleusis, Delphi, and Athens. Featuring scenes of maenads, aristocrats, and wine-mixing rituals, Dionysus was worshipped during this festival, honored as a divine child, and celebrated his rebirth after being ripped apart by the Titans. In the Eleusinian mysteries, the Hierophant was involved and led a pomp or procession, which likely ended with a sacrifice. References mention a procession and an agon contest held by torchlight, where the Hierophant invoked Dionysus. The chorus would respond by calling, Iachos, son of Semele, Plautodotes, giver of wealth. Giver of wealth, there's your Theodosia, the god giving gifts. Overall, the Lenaia seems to be about agriculture, focusing on nature's renewal. It symbolized the grapevine and wine tied to Dionysus himself, his death, and his return from the underworld. However, this wasn't the time for grape harvesting, but for pruning the vines, an important step in preparing for the next growing season. Nature is reflected in the myth of Dionysus being born premature after a term of 7 months, and needed to be sown in the thigh of Zeus until he was born a 3rd time, making him Dionysus thrice born. This would represent the spring season, 2 months after January, in March. Lenaia comes from the Lenos, wine press, and from the Lenae, another name for the maenads. The counterpart to the Lenaia of Delphi and Athens is the Haloa, celebrated principally at Eleusis, which took place at the same time, the winter solstice and early January, but only in Eleusis, although some sources suggest that a threshing floor was made during this time throughout Attica, so people outside of Eleusis can observe this outside of Eleusis. Haloa means threshing floor, Alonia, named because of the festival took place near a threshing floor. All women were expected to take part in the festival, while men were almost always left out. However, men were legally and morally required to pay for their wives' expenses at this event. It's unusual that this harvest festival happened in midwinter, but there's a reason for this. The Greeks believed the festival was sacred not just to Demeter, but to Dionysus. When Dionysus became part of the worship, the festival's timing shifted to winter. As one source puts it, he took over Demeter's festivals, her threshing floor, and turned it into a winter celebration. In some ways, the festival became more about Dionysus than Demeter, showing his growing influence and the importance of wine in Greek religion. On a practical level, the Greeks managed to gather part of the harvest just in time to celebrate and party with Dionysus. This shows how central he was to their culture and festivities. Eustathius, citing Pausanias, says the festival of Haloa was held for Demeter and Dionysus. During this festival, people brought the first fruits from the harvest from Athens to Eleusis to honor the gods. There's your Xenia right there. There were also sporting events held on the threshing floors and a special procession for Poseidon, who was worshipped with the epithet Phytalmios, the god of plants. The procession of the gods represented the god's Epiphany, and the feast was the Xenia. And lastly, the first fruits brought were the gifts from the gods, along with the wine from the threshing floor. Once again, Theophany-Theoxeny-Theodosia. According to a scholion on Aristophanes' frogs, the Eleusinian Hierophant, or high priest, told the worshippers to summon the god Epiphany, and they hailed him as Semeleos Iacchos Plautodotas, translated as Earthborn Iacchos, giver of wealth, or Semele's son Iacchos, Pluto bringer, Theodosia, containing the name of Semele, the mortal mother of Dionysus, Iacchus, the divine child of both Semele and Persephone, and Plautos, the wealth bringer, which is also depicted in Roman statues as a divine child of Demeter, who represents the gifts of wealth. The Theban chorus of old men in Sophocles' Antigone hails many named Dionysus as Bacchius Io, son of Dios, and Iacchos Io Bacchae. Appears in the refrain of the paean for Dionysus, written for a Theoxenia festival at Delphi in the year 340 BCE. The paean is written literally for a theoxany. It involves a theophany of a god who has an epithet of wealth giver, which is Theodosia. So once again, we find in this ancient scholion a reference to a theophany for Dionysus, who brings gifts, Theodosia, and it takes place during Xenia, Theoxeny. As already discussed, it is also at this time of the year, in Thebes, Elis, Andros, Naxos, Teos, and Corinth, that there was another Epiphany feast that was celebrated in the Mid-Winter, called by Aristotle the rural Dionysia, by Pausanias the Thuia, and by Pliny the Elder, Theodosia, in which Bacchus gives the gift of wine to those who keep his temples in order and hold his feast, the Theoxeny. This tradition can be traced all the way back to at least the 4th century BCE, when Aristotle and Theopompus describe in nearly identical accounts a festival taking place in Elis. There is a place about 8 furlongs from Elis where the natives at the time of the Dionysian Games close up 3 empty brazen vessels and seal them in the presence of all the people. And at subsequent time, they open them and find them full of wine. If you noticed, this particular tradition doesn't have any flowing streams of water, but instead describes 3 empty brazen vessels, sealed and found later, miraculously, with wine. No water into wine, but instead wine from nothing. However, the word they use in Greek for brazen vessels, lebes, was a specific cultic vessel used for religious water purification ceremonies, and appears to have been a part of a pre-wedding purification ceremony, often made into Dionysian pottery. It may have stood by the bride's door and was probably used in ritual sprinkling of the bride with water. The author of John's Gospel, the most Dionysian Gospel, as MacDonald demonstrates in his peer-reviewed book, goes out of its way to explain to the audience that Jesus, who turns water into wine, is using a very specific stone jug that were used for exactly that, water purification rites being used at a wedding. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the masters of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water, that it had been turned to wine. The wedding at Cana, which is also venerated at the Epiphany feast of January 6th, as I pointed out, describes Jesus using ceremonial religious jugs like the priest of Dionysus, who miraculously make wine for the feast. And to this very day, some Eastern Orthodox churches still celebrate the birth, epiphany, baptism, and wedding on January 6th, the tradition of John and Basilides. Aristotle echoes an almost identical tradition, again in the same place, Elis, which he calls the Dionysia. In Elis, they say there is a building about 8 stanes away from the city, into which at the Dionysia they place 3 empty bronze cauldrons. Once again, the word in Greek is lebes, primarily used for ceremonial washings at weddings and religious rituals, the same described of Jesus in John 2. When they have done this, they call upon any of the visiting Greeks who wishes to examine the vessels and seal up the doors of the house. When they are going to open it, they show the seals to the citizens and strangers and then open it. Those who go in find the cauldrons full of wine. Now, Aristotle and Theopompus' accounts differ from the previous 5 primary sources in that these ones have brazen vessels and the other ones describe a flowing spring that changes into wine. However, the last source, Pausanias, in the mid-2nd century, describes this tradition in the same way as Theopompus and Aristotle, same place, Elis, with empty brazen jars, lebes, being filled. But Pausanias also mentions the island of Andros, which oddly enough was previously connected to the stream fountain tradition, which means that Pausanias connects the traditions into one and also demonstrates the continued tradition from the 4th century BCE to the 2nd century of the Common Era, going before, through, and after the time of the Gospels being written and Basilides. Between the marketplace and the Menaios is an old theater and shrine of Dionysus. The image is the work of Praxiteles. Of the gods, the Elians worship Dionysus with the greatest reverence, and they assert that the god attends their festival, the Thuia. The place where they hold the festival, they name the Thuia, is about 8 stades from the city. 3 pots are brought into the building by the priests and set down, empty, in the presence of the citizens and of the strangers who may chance to be in the country. The doors of the building are sealed by the priests themselves and by any others who may be so inclined. On the morrow, they are allowed to examine the seals, and ongoing into the building, they find the pots with wine filled. The Andrians too assert that every other year at their feast of Dionysus, wine flows of its own accord from the sanctuary. Pausanias combines these traditions together. It becomes painfully obvious that Basilides' tradition of the January 6th baptism epiphany from John's Gospel, which was later morphed into the Eastern Orthodox Theophany, has been greatly influenced by the January 6th Dionysus Epiphany traditions of ancient Greece. The January 6th Epiphany traditions check the boxes of the Theophany, Theoxenia, and Theodosia. Number 1, Theophany, Epiphany of Dionysus. 2, Theoxeny, the temple of Dionysus is prepared for the procession. 3, Theodosia, the god gives his gift of wine from water. 1, Theophany, the Epiphany of Jesus. 2, Theoxeny, Jesus is baptized by John and the way is prepared. Number 3, Theodosia. Jesus gives salvation to the world.
When we get into Dionysus and stuff like that, people are like, "Oh, Dionysus's tradition has this, that, and the other, and that's very Christian." It's like, well, if you look at this, there are the things that are most similar to Jesus are things that pop up in the Dionysus tradition from after the time of Jesus. And that's not to say that it influenced the Dionysus tradition. It's just to say that's not an inspiration for the Jesus tradition.
Right. Now, after an hour and 16 minutes of this video, I have already presented 7 primary sources about wine miracles in Dionysus. 5 of them are water turning into wine explicitly, and they predate the Gospels.
And there's an argument.
And Jesus could have been an inspiration for some of the Dionysian tradition. That's possible.
And I've looked in the
Now, I don't know what that means. I looked. For someone with a Ph.D. biblical studies who still has major Dunning-Kruger. I mean, this guy is online pretending to be an umpire, calling balls and strikes, scolding people for not agreeing with what he calls overwhelming scholarly consensus. Half the time, these things have nuance. Sometimes there's a lot of hot debates on these topics. This one, for sure, he has not checked in on. There's current articles from 2021 that I'm showing on the screen, presenting all of the data that I presented in this video about Dionysus turning water into wine, and one of them, Pliny the Elder, happening on the same night as the Epiphany. He looked, and he must did a Google search, and didn't come up right away. So he looked. He's got a PhD, so if he looked, then it must not be there.
And I've looked in the two things I have found regarding Dionysus that come closest to turning water into wine. There's a tradition about him. He likes the look of some nymph that comes and drinks at this stream every day, and he decides that he's going to replace the water with wine. And so it doesn't say turned water into wine. It says he replaced the water with wine of the stream, so the nymph became drunk, so he was able to have his way with her.
You couldn't find Pliny the Elder, you couldn't find Seneca, you couldn't find Diodorus of Sicily, you couldn't find Theopompus, you couldn't find Aristotle. I was able to find them. The amateur.
He decides that he's going to replace the water with wine. And so it doesn't say turned water into wine. It says he replaced the water with wine of the streams.
So let me get this straight on this source that you brought up. Let's go with this one. You think that the ancients would have read this text about Dionysus replacing water? Let's just go with your interpretation of the Greek. So you think the ancients would have read this text and thought that Dionysus went and got a water pump, pumped out all the water in the stream, came back with a dump truck full of wine, and replaced it like that? You think that's how the ancients would have read this text?
And I've looked in the other tradition is the notion that there was a tradition associated with a temple dedicated to Dionysus where they would put empty vases in the temple, and then when they came back the next morning, on the day of a certain festival, the vases would be filled with wine. So that's that's the closest.
Boom. That proves it. I don't know what you're talking about. Suddenly we've proven that Dionysus and Jesus are absolutely ripping each other off.
Both born on December 25th.
The ironic part about this source, this is the Theopompus and Aristotle / Pausanias tradition. In this one, you're right, there is no water in the jars, they're empty. But the jars are specifically called lebes, which are specific for wedding and ceremonial washing, which if you look at the wedding at Cana passage, the jars that Jesus is using, even though they're stone jars, it says that these are the ones the Jews use for ceremonial washing, and it's at a wedding. So it looks like if John did know this tradition, he was at least winking to the Gentile audience that these are the ones that the Jews use. And we know you guys use those lebes, but the Jews use these ones. So there is an actual connection here, regardless of one having water and the other one being empty. The arbitrary parameters that you're throwing on these stories, because there's some sort of differences that one can't influence the other, is really alarming for someone to claim to be an expert. Which brings me to the last point in this video, December 25th. There is no clear-cut scholarly consensus on how we really get this date. Anyone who claims there is one is lying or is not immersed in the academic papers and primary sources regarding Christians choosing December 25th, because this topic is very messy, and almost everyone that studies it will have a different opinion on how this all played out. The big three academic articles on this, in chronological order of when they came out: Sol Invictus, the Winter Solstice, and the Origins of Christmas by Jiménez. In this article, Jiménez argues that the evidence for Sol Invictus and Mithras being the sole reason why Christians adopted December 25th is slim, but he never says once that this is something that is impossible either. He just argues that this should be not taken as fact, and he argues that the evidence suggests that Christians actually chose the summer solstice for the birth of John on June 24th, while selecting December 25th, the winter solstice, for Christ. And the equinoxes are the dates for both of their conceptions, a cosmic birth cycle for the two major figures of the Gospels. Jiménez also lays out the nuances, admitting that there is no official feast set by the Church until the 330s AD. No explicit mention of the birthday of Christ until 354 that is known widespread. The other two more recent articles of the Big Three are Peter Nothaft's Early Christian Chronology and the Origins of the Christmas Date, in defense of the calculation theory, 2013, and Calculating December 25th as the birth of Jesus in Hippolytus's Canon and Chronicon, Thomas Schmidt, 2015. In these two articles, they add to what Jiménez argues, even citing him, but adding their own arguments that calculations likely were done by Julius Africanus in 221, the Chronographia, according to Nothaft, and Hippolytus in 235 in his canon, according to Schmidt. And like Jiménez, both of these scholars are incredibly nuanced and both admit that there is no explicit text from either of them that show that Christ was born on December 25th in a plain text. Nothaft admits that the Chronographia by Africanus is a lost, reconstructed text and subject to interpolation, while Schmidt admits that Hippolytus himself wrote that Christ was born on April 2nd, and that we have to ignore his own writings and instead speculate on what Hippolytus may have calculated if he decides to apply Moses' death and conception dates to be the same day. You might be surprised to hear how messy and unclear this is, considering how many lazy academics you've seen scolding people on the internet over suggesting that December 25th could have possibly been co-opted by pagan Roman traditions, or even joking about it. These wannabe intellectuals spend hours every day scolding anyone who thinks Christmas isn't a pure original date that may have been adopted by the cultural milieu. One of them is Dan McClellan.
How did Christians arrive at December 25th as the date of Jesus' birth? There are absolutely no data from the ancient world that identify December 25th as the birth date of any pre-existing deity.
The definitive statement, absolutely no data,
There are absolutely no data,
is wrong. It's misleading, comes off as dogmatic, or just grossly incompetent, showing lack of knowledge of the primary sources. The argument is very simple for Mithras being related to December 25th. The Persian holiday known as Yalda Night, which means birth night, is traditionally linked to Mithras and the sun. However, as Jiménez points out, the data is so slim and we have almost no sources from the Persians themselves about Yalda Night. We're left with educated conjecture. Now, it is also true that the Persians had a different calendar than the Romans. The Romans, after Julius Caesar created the Julian calendar, listed the winter solstice on December 25th. Therefore, if there was a continuation of Yalda Night into the Roman religion, which we just don't know if there was, then December 25th would have been significant for Mithras. Also, given the fact that Sol Invictus was synced with Mithras, and Aurelian institutes a feast and temple on December 25th leads many scholars from the history of religion side, based on educated conjecture, that Mithras was linked with December 25th. Now, you can argue that all of this is speculation and you disagree with it, and that's fine. But this definitive statement of,
there are absolutely no data from the ancient world that identify December 25th as the birth date of any pre-existing deity,
is just wrong and misleading.
Others will say it was stolen from the celebration of Sol Invictus, which did take place on December 25th, but only starting in the year 276 CE, when an emperor dedicated a temple to Sol Invictus on December 25th. We already have indications that Christians had identified December 25th as the date of Jesus' birth decades prior to that.
He is grossly misleading to say the data suggest that Christians already chose this date. Is at best misleading, at worst a lie.
We already have indications that Christians had identified December 25th as the date of Jesus' birth decades prior to that.
That this presupposes that Christmas is already an official feast in Rome. Because you have to be very careful. Just because a text mentions that Christ was born on that date doesn't mean they have a feast. Especially knowing how skeptical Christians in the 3rd century were about birth dates, whether it's birth dates of persons or birthdays of individuals or of gods. We have a whole sort of slew of authors who make fun of that idea. So we have to be very cautious here. The chronograph attestations could point to the existence of Christmas as a liturgical feast, but it's only the sermons that are a bit later that definitely support that Christmas was already an event in the liturgical year. Having said that, we know nothing about how Christmas was celebrated apart from the fact that people went to church and listened to sermons. Right? That is very disappointing if the whole reason you're having this debate is to prove that what people are doing in the 21st century on Christmas Day has anything to do with what happened in the 4th century.
The data only suggests that possibly 2 people, Hippolytus and Julius Africanus, possibly could have calculated dates based on the text that we have from them. There are indications in their text that they made these calculations. To say that Christians as a group already chose this date is misleading.
We already have indications that Christians had identified December 25th as the date of Jesus' birth decades prior to that.
Even if we grant that both of them made these calculations, we still don't know if this was widely known. It still wasn't a feast yet. We don't even know how widely known it was.
You know what the evidence tells us, the way the evidence falls down on us. 274 is the date that we get for any explicit mention of anything being related to December 25th for any god.
Yes. And as you of course say, obviously the winter solstice is part of the background that leads to this date being chosen, and there's a general trend towards cosmological symbolism and imagery in the 3rd century, which becomes just more noticeable in the sources, and more attention is paid to astrological connotations and so on.
Yeah. Now, that brings us to the other side of the coin, the Christmas thing, because I think you can also say the same thing about Christmas. Even though there's indications that there are calculations happening, don't you think it's fair to say that we don't have any explicit mentions of a festival of Christmas until later?
Yes. No, you have to be very careful. Again, the chronograph of 354 is a difficult source because the manuscripts are extremely late. There's always this danger of interpolation. Some of the dating issues are not very obvious. So I always say the earliest really secure reference that we have are these sermons by presumably Optatus of Miletus, who was a North African bishop. So that takes us to the early 360s, around the same time when Julian the Apostate talks about the 25th of December being a feast for Helios, the sun god. We have the earliest secure reference to Christmas. But
so they're kind of tied. They're kind of tied with the evidence.
It's a bit of a tie. I mean,
which is also why the way he presents this data is a textbook example of a double standard. It's a double standard for 2 reasons. First, why it is a double standard is because on one hand, he and others are speculating about the earliest possible calculations that could have perhaps taken place by Christians. But by no means is he going by the explicit mentions of a feast for Christ's birth on December 25th, which is 100% during the middle of the 4th century, at the 330s at the earliest. Any calculations before this would have been by single people, privately, by themselves, and we have no evidence that they took root or became official Christian feast dates. In fact, Origen and Tertullian give us statements that prove that Christians were not only taking part in pagan customs during Mid-Winter, Brumalia, and New Year's feast, but that they were abhorrent to the idea of even celebrating the birth of Christ at all, which I will show later. Secondly, when they talk about the Sol Invictus December 25th dates, they don't apply the same logic. They're looking for official feast dates in the record, explicit and widely known. They're not looking for any data that could suggest that Sol Invictus or Mithraeus possibly venerated December 25th, because that would be comparing apples to apples. Dan is not comparing apples to apples. He is comparing apples to oranges. He is not looking at the data to see if Mithraist or Roman imperial cultus may have perhaps venerated solstices before any explicit official dates like 274, when Aurelian dedicated a temple on December 25th to Sol Invictus. If we compare apples to apples, 274 is the first explicit, widespread observance of December 25th in any manner, even if it's not a feast yet. And 330 to 354 would be the first explicit, widespread observance of Christmas on December 25th. But they don't use that date. They're looking for possible calculations by single people rather than comparing apples to apples. On the 8th day before the calends of January, December 25th, Christ was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Again, comparing apples to apples would be showing widespread observance of a Sol Invictus feast versus the widespread observance of Christmas. Any individual private calculation can go unnoticed by the populace at large. These people are not one mind. They did not have email and DMs. Even if one Christian calculated the birth of Christ at the solstice in one place, we still don't know if he is the reason or if there was another reason why the calculation was by someone else. It is true that 274 CE is the first explicit mention of anything being dedicated to Sol Invictus publicly on December 25th. But comparing oranges to oranges, there is plenty of data to suggest that Mithraists were venerating solstices long before this. Porphyry's Cave of Nymphs, the mysteries of Mithras, the mediator, that was handed down to Zoroaster the Magian, in which Porphyry is clear, initiated in both processes. A celebration of mortality at the summer solstice implied complementary celebration of immortality at the winter solstice. He also ties the freeing of souls to Saturnalia, and Saturn was a central figure in the Mithraic mysteries. This is one of the only texts that survive about the Mithraic mysteries, and they happen to highlight the importance of the solstices. On top of this, a published peer-reviewed article from 1998 titled The Meeting of the Virina Mithraists on June 26, 184 explains how multiple Mithraeums in the 2nd and 3rd century were being dedicated within a 24-hour period on the prescribed Julian calendar dates for the summer solstice, June 25th. The reason why I highlight that they dedicated on the prescribed dates is because Dan, in a separate video, almost didn't even know that the Romans had fixed days for the solstices in their Julian calendar for December 25th.
They're saying that like December 25th is when it was thought, is when the ancients thought the equinox, not the equinox, what's the winter summer one?
Winter solstice.
Solstice, the winter solstice. So
Yeah.
they thought that it was the 25th. It was the 21st, but they thought it was the 25th or whatever. And so
21st, but they thought it was the 25th or whatever. And so
Nothing comes close to being cringier than when somebody's smug and wrong at the same time, and lacking the awareness to even know that they're wrong, so they had the confidence to be smug and scold. The idea that the solstice was wrong because our solstice today is the 21st or 22nd, so they were just wrong, is nonsense. There was a different calendar. The Julian calendar marked December 25th from the 40s BCE till the 16th century, December 25th, the winter solstice. Now, it is true that there was a drift because the Julian calendar was off. However, this would not matter. They didn't follow the drift. They set their date, which means if there is any dates for Sol Invictus or Mithras, theirs would stay the same too. It doesn't matter if they're off or not. What matters is what they thought. When I called out Dan McClellan for this, he at first admitted he was wrong, but then the next day immediately doubled down and pretended that it was talking about the 3rd century, which might have been 2.5 days drift. But he never in this clip indicated that, oh, in the 3rd century, Romans thought it was December 25th, but it actually was the 22nd. If Dan had said that, I never would have criticized him. Dan doesn't say that. Dan made it seem like the 22nd Gregorian calendar date for the solstice has always been correct. So his double down is just a sign that he's not honest.
Right.
And yeah, the winter solstice thing is silly because the solstice is the 22nd, sometimes with a little bit of wiggle room. The 25th was actually the observed celebration of the solstice in the Roman Empire for a time.
Dan suggests that Mithras would sit there every day and count the amount of hours of sunlight to find out which day is the exact winter solstice. I asked if there was any evidence for this claim, and Dan was not able to show any. In fact, the solstices are very hard to pin down. You would not know the difference between any of the days of the week that the solstice happens on. The equinox, on the other hand, you can know, because the equinox is exactly 12 days of light and 12 days of darkness, depending on either of the equinoxes. The solstices, depending on the winter or summer solstice, either has lots of sunlight, the most sunlight in the day, which is the summer solstice, or very little sunlight, winter solstice. In fact, I'm going to ask you, the viewer, right now, have you noticed the difference in sunlight between today and yesterday, or even the day before that? Maybe tomorrow, will you notice the difference between sunlight? No, it's very little. During this time of the year, the average person would not have noticed which day is the winter solstice. It would have took about 1,000 years to notice the drift. 1 day or 2 days or 3 days or even a week would barely be noticeable. In a more recent academic article from 2011 called A Ray of Light from Mithras, 4 Ph.D. archaeologists from Poland, Michał Galakowski, Ph.D., Krzysztof Jakubiak, Ph.D., University of Warsaw, Institute of Archaeology, Wisław Malkowski, Ph.D., University at Warsaw, Faculty of Archaeology, Arkadiusz Soltysiak, Ph.D., University at Warsaw, Department of Archaeology. All 4 explain how a Mithraeum is unearthed in Syria and supposedly was built at the end of the 3rd century and dedicated on December 25th and designed to reflect light on a painted wall fresco of Mithras during the period between December 25th and January 6th. Even a 3rd academic paper, The Winter Solstice and the Mithraeum at Braccialitia, 2017, by Emilia Carolina Sparavina, Ph.D., Polytechnic University of Turin, suggests that a Mithraeum in Britain, in which the orientation of the temple was chosen to recall the birth of Mithras on December 25th. The archaeological data shows us that not only was Aurelian following the set fixed date of December 25th, the winter solstice, dedicated to Sol Invictus, but Mithraists across the empire followed solstice dates on the prescribed Julian dates. Temples built like this are nothing new either. Temples like this were built in Egypt to showcase the sun rising on an altar during the winter solstice, such as the one that I'm showing right now is at Karnak in Egypt. I was there myself. The winter solstice has always been a special day for ancient local pagan traditions, long before Christianity or Sol Invictus. Dan then completely lies to his audience in a completely sneaky way when he says this.
And this comes toward the end of a long period of calculations within Christianity of different dates for different significant events, such as the creation of the universe, and Jesus' conception, and Jesus' death. By the end of the 2nd century CE, Christians had identified March 25th as the date of Jesus' crucifixion, and had also determined that that was the date of his conception.
There is no explicit mention of anyone at the end of the 2nd century tying Jesus' conception to the day of his death.
By the end of the 2nd century CE, Christians had identified March 25th as the date of Jesus' crucifixion, and had also determined that that was the date of his conception.
There is no explicit mention of anyone at the end of the 2nd century tying Jesus' conception to the day of his death, which both Nothaft and Schmidt argue in their paper. There is no explicit mention of Jesus' conception, unless we grant that the commentary on Daniel passage is authentic, or speculate a little bit for other passages they wrote. But Dan is not honest about this, and makes it seem as if Christians, by the end of the 2nd century, calculated Jesus' birth already. Dan seems like he hasn't read any of the 3 major articles on this subject, and has no grasp on the nuances involved in this topic.
And this most likely has to do with a convention that was in circulation around that time among historians, who usually identified the dates of important historical figures' deaths with the dates of their births. But for Jesus, it was identified with the date of his conception.
Another grossly incorrect statement that Dan McClellan makes.
With a convention that was in circulation around that time among historians, who usually identified the dates of important historical figures' deaths with the dates of their birth.
Then the question is, okay, March 25th as the date for his death, we've got an establishment for that. How do you make the jump between that and what seems to have happened from the evidence from Africanus you were talking about before, which is associating that date with the date of his conception? How does that work?
So the short, there's no direct evidence that would explain this, and that has often been used as an argument against the so-called calculation hypothesis. There's like this arbitrary decision to parallelize the crucifixion and the conception.
Truth is, we don't have any examples of historians from this time who linked important figures' deaths with their births. We have one example, and even that one is not clear. The closest example we have to this is Moses. Deuteronomy 34:7. Moses was 120 years old when he died. Due to this vague passage in Deuteronomy, some Judeo-Christians believe that Moses may have died on the day that he turned 120 years old. Tim O'Neill repeats this point too, saying, within Judaism, there was a tradition that prophets died on the same date which they were conceived. This is not a tradition anywhere. There's only about Moses, and it's in the Talmud. Tim O'Neill, who spends his entire days on Twitter, battling fringe mythicists and what he likes to call new atheists. If you dare to even check this guy's Twitter page and just scroll down just to see how much he's obsessed with defending Christianity from what he calls new atheists and mythicists, it will make you nauseous to see how much time he spends on the internet battling fringe mythicists. He dishonestly writes this about the calculation theory. Perhaps April 2nd, Hippolytus of Rome, 170-235. But Hippolytus also gives the date as the 8 days before the calends of January, December 25th. And it was December 25th that eventually predominated, at first in Rome and then elsewhere in the empire. What he did here is criminally dishonest. He puts these passages in a certain order, as if this is how it was presented by Hippolytus. And he doesn't tell us that one of these passages is highly criticized and scrutinized by scholars and hotly debated to this day.
Hippolytus also gives us a possible indication that December 25th was already regarded to be the date of birth at his time, for 2 reasons. One is that his name is also attached to a commentary on the book of Daniel, which is in fact the earliest preserved Christian commentary on a book of the Old Testament, which was probably written quite soon after 200. If that's true, it's an exceptionally early text. And there's a passage in that commentary which once again mentions these 5,500 years between the creation of the world and the incarnation of Christ, but it also mentions the birth. And in most manuscripts, that birth is explicitly dated to December 25th. However, there's one manuscript, which is one of the earliest, which doesn't have this additional information. And then the earliest manuscript actually has two dates, December 25th and a fragment of another date. And most scholars believe or have believed ever since the 19th century that this is the result of an interpolation, which can happen very easily. Because once Christians are convinced that December 25th is the correct date, there's a temptation to just insert that into texts where the date wasn't included, or maybe another date was included, and that gets replaced with the supposedly correct date. This can happen very easily. And if you study textual transmission, you find examples like that a lot.
Yeah.
So we can't rely on that passage, unfortunately, which is a big shame.
You would think Tim O'Neill, the atheist, would like to educate his readers on the nuances going on in scholarship. But no, Tim O'Neill just wants to win against mythicists. So he's just going to accept this as authentic and ignore any scholarship that says this is not authentic, including the articles that he cites, Nothaft, Hijmans, and Schmidt. He first lists the passage from Hippolytus' Chronicon, which is dated to 235, where he says, perhaps April 2nd, which is not what Hippolytus actually says. Hippolytus inscribed on his table that the genesis of Christ occurred on April 2nd, 2 BCE. He doesn't say perhaps. This is dated to 235. This is dated to 1 year before Hippolytus died. The last thing he wrote on the subject of the birth of Christ is that he was born on April 2nd. But Tim reverses the order, puts perhaps in front of April 2nd, and then says, but Hippolytus also gives the date and says the December 25th thing. Why did Tim reverse the order and not give the dates for these passages? Because it would be confusing that Hippolytus would declare that Christ was born on December 25th so blatantly in 205, but then 30 years later blatantly contradict himself and then say Christ was born on April 2nd. This is one of the many reasons why myself and a ton of scholars do not accept the commentary on Daniel passage to be authentic.
And I think the two sources that are most important here are the various texts that are attributed to Hippolytus of Rome, and then there's also the Chronicle of Julius Africanus.
Not only does it contradict what Hippolytus wrote 30 years later, but why would Hippolytus need to do any calculations for the birth of Christ in two later texts if he already knew that Christ was born on the winter solstice, December 25th? Why would no other church fathers from this time period know about this date either, or cite Hippolytus? In fact, all the writers from this period that do mention Hippolytus don't say anything about December 25th. You would think other Christians from this time period, considering how big of a deal Hippolytus was, would know this. T.C. Schmidt from Yale, Ph.D. of the New Testament, in his translation and analysis of Hippolytus' works, Schmidt discusses the complexities surrounding the December 25th date. He notes that while the commentary on Daniel is generally considered to be authentic, however, the specific mention of December 25th as Christ's birth date, a later interpolation, Schmidt emphasizes the need for caution given the manuscript transmission history and the potential for scribal additions. Schmidt points out that the oldest manuscripts for this text that we have in physical form date to centuries later, 10th century, after the time of Hippolytus lived, and long after Christmas was a holiday, with plenty of incentives for scribes to add this interpolation. Again, this is just common sense, given that Hippolytus literally says that Christ was born on April 2nd in a text dated to 30 years after this. This isn't just me being dogmatic about Christmas. The data makes no sense. Roger Pearce, Ph.D., who is also a committed Christian, and not biased at all, examines the manuscript evidence and suggests that the explicit reference to December 25th might not have been part of the original text. He points out that the earliest manuscripts containing this reference date from centuries after Hippolytus' time, raising the possibility of a later interpolation. Again, common sense given the context of Hippolytus later writing something that completely contradicts this. The lack of any Christian writers who discuss the date of Christ's birth do not ever reference Hippolytus' December 25th date, demonstrating that it may not have been a widely recognized or even present in the original text at all. Origen writes, "And on birthdays, when the lawless word reigns over them, they dance so that their movements please that word." Someone of those before us has observed what is written in Genesis about the birthday of Pharaoh, and has told that the worthless man who loves things connected with birth keeps birthday festivals. And we, taking this suggestion from him, find in no scripture that a birthday was kept by a righteous man. Origen in 245 writes this as if there is no widespread birthday of Christ yet. Origen would not write this if there was. This is a defeater that there was any widespread birthday of Christ on December 25th. Origen, this late in the game, is just 3 decades before Aurelian dedicated a temple to Sol Invictus on December 25th. And he has no knowledge of any birthday of Christ on December 25th. In fact, he shows the kind of opposite mentality exists among his circle, that celebrating birthdays is for pagans. You would think Origen would know that Hippolytus wrote about the birth of Christ on December 25th, 40 years earlier, almost a half a century prior. Other academics point out other issues with this passage, manuscript variations. The earliest surviving manuscripts of the commentary on Daniel are from the later medieval period, leaving a significant gap between Hippolytus' era and the extant copies. This gap allows for the possibility of interpolations. Theological motivations are huge here. The establishment of December 25th as a date for Christmas became prominent in the 4th century. Some scholars argue that earlier texts were retroactively aligned with this tradition, leading to potential insertions of the date into earlier works. All this is messy, and again, I am willing to grant that calculations were made during the 3rd century, but Hippolytus in 205 just makes no sense. And widespread observance of these calculations are not in the church tradition yet. But is Tim O'Neill, the unbiased atheist, willing to teach his audience about all of this nuance regarding the controversial date of December 25th? The reference to Hippolytus that is a hotly debated topic. Nope, he just writes it down as if it's 100% authentic, with no manuscript issues and no scholars contesting it. And he doesn't even cite it correctly. In the same article, Tim makes all the same mistakes that Dan makes regarding Sol Invictus and Mithras, showing his lack of knowledge of the primary sources, trying to separate the two deities, Mithras and Sol Invictus, as if they weren't worshipped by the same Roman imperial cult and were not synced into a theocracia since the time of Antiochus in 86 BCE, when he dedicated an altar to Helios Apollo Mithras, as well as dozens and dozens of inscriptions and iconography that depict Mithras Sol Invictus as one dyadic godhead, and only a small handful of examples where they are separated into twins. Obviously, Tim shows one of those examples, but not the other ones. But even if they were just twin gods, that would still open up the possibility of both of them being tied to the solstices. This is just simple logic. Premise 1. Mithras was synced with Sol Invictus through theocracia. Premise 2. Mithras and Sol both have dedicated Mithraeums and temples to them on the Julian calendar fixed solstices, June 25th and December 25th. Conclusion. Mithras like Sol Invictus, is connected to December 25th. Very simple argument based on very simple premises. Anyone who says Mithras has nothing to do with December 25th is either lying or not immersed in the primary sources. Even Jiménez doesn't argue this. Jiménez says the evidence is slim, not none. Calculation of December 25th from the conception/death date of March 25th predates any need to co-opt pagan festivals by about 200 years. Even if I granted the earliest possible date, which would be 204 to 205, Aurelian's feast is only 70 years later. Where is he getting 200 years from?
That this presupposes that Christmas is already an official feast in Rome. Because you have to be very careful. Just because a text mentions that Christ was born on that date doesn't mean they have a feast. Especially knowing how skeptical Christians in the 3rd century were about birth dates, whether it's birth dates of persons or birthdays of individuals or of gods. We have a whole sort of slew of authors who make fun of that idea. So we have to be very cautious here. The chronograph attestations could point to the existence of Christmas as a liturgical feast, but it's only the sermons that are a bit later that definitely support that Christmas was already an event in the liturgical year. Having said that, we know nothing about how Christmas was celebrated apart from the fact that people went to church and listened to sermons. Right? That is very disappointing if the whole reason you're having this debate is to prove that what people are doing in the 21st century on Christmas Day has anything to do with what happened in the 4th century.
That tells me, even though Macrobius is late, it tells me that there was some sort of trend of some sort of godhead being born at the winter solstice.
Yeah, I mean, there's something going on in the background. Unfortunately, often these Greco-Roman sources, right, they're not always so in touch with these cults, and there's a lot of syncretism going on that sometimes, hides a bit what's going on in the plumbing. I mean, a good example is Plutarch, right? Plutarch, in his treatise on Isis and Osiris, also mentions the idea that the Horus child is brought into the world at the winter solstice. Where I think there is a legitimate connection is between the wedding of Cana and the fact that it was put on, that it was put together with Epiphany, and the fact that you have around that time of the year cultic practices that relate to Dionysius in various parts of the Hellenistic world. That might even be the origin of that episode in the Gospel of John chapter 2, right?
So what do I think about December 25th? I agree with this passage by Professor Forster. While this celebration seems to have originally taken place on January 6th, the Epiphany, the Roman Church later settled for the solstice on December 25th, a date chosen for its affinity with popular Christian solar symbolism. January 6th is the reason for the season, and December 25th was an added bonus. It is my understanding that the calculations done by Hippolytus and perhaps others in the early and middle of the 3rd century calculated the birth of Christ with the full intentions that they wanted to land the birth of Jesus on the winter solstice of the Julian calendar, December 25th, as they were already close enough and had the Epiphany on January 6th, long before, which was influenced by Dionysian Theophany. The midwinter traditions that were already thriving were a huge deal to everyday Christian Roman citizens who, according to Chrysostom, loved theaters, loved games, loved gambling, and festivities. To demonstrate how radical this change was, even as late as 200 CE, a horrified Tertullian shows us how his fellow Christians were being tricked by the devil into following pagan customs of Saturnalia and Brumalia. The devil, forsooth, has plastered over the Christian profession with his showy gods, that he may glorify himself in the pomp of the Christian name, as if he too were in it. However, the majority of Christians have, by this time, persuaded themselves that it is permissible to make use of that kind of feast day, as they think, on the grounds that its observance is of general character. By us, however, who are strangers to Sabbaths and new moons and festivals once acceptable to God, the Saturnalia, the Calends, the New Year, the Brumalia festivals, Midwinter, and Matronalia festivals are frequented. Presents come and go, New Year's gifts, games join their noise, banquets join their din. Oh, better fidelity of the nations to their own sex, which claims no solemnity of the Christians for itself, not the Lord's Day, not Pentecost. Even if they had known, would they have shared with us? For they would be afraid lest they seem to be Christians. We are not apprehensive lest we seem to be heathens. If any indulged is to be granted to the flesh, you have it. I will not say your own days, but more too. For the heathens, each festive day occurs but once annually. You have a festive day every 8th day. Why would so many Christians be celebrating these midwinter solstices before the alleged calculations take place? If the rites of Christmas have nothing to do with pagan traditions, this passage is a defeater for anyone that thinks that there is no influence of paganism on Christmas. Christians were able to purify existing traditions and co-opt them the same way Christians co-opted pagan temples and turned them into new churches. They transformed pagan gods and turned them into saints, like Saint Demetrius. With the word Demeter in his name, he was visited by the goddess Demeter in a dream in a 5th century legend and was told by the goddess Demeter to worship Christ. Saint George, the dragon slayer, replaces Theseus, the dragon slayer, as his church of St. George was built directly over an ancient pagan temple to Theseus. These examples go on and on. Before I end this video, I have to give you one more taste of what's coming down the pipeline. Even Easter is not safe from pagan influence. Yes, you heard that right. I will leave you all with a teaser for an upcoming video topic, according to the current consensus among classicists, citing Robert Turkin, Cults of the Roman Empire, Antonia Tripolitis, Religions of the Hellenistic Roman Age, Franz Cumont, Roman Religion, Mary Beard, Religions of Rome, and even John of Lydia, an ancient primary source. The following is agreed on to be true. Before the Gospels are even written, during the 40s CE, Emperor Claudius instituted a new religious festival during the month of March at the spring equinox. On March 15th, the Ides, a flamen dialis of Jupiter, sacrifices a white lamb to the full moon, which corresponds to Nisan 14, the day that Jesus was crucified as the Passover lamb. After this, the Hilaria is kicked off. On March 22nd, a day of mourning was underway. A pine tree was buried with an effigy of the god Attis on it. Attis was buried in the ground while women mourned for 3 days. On the 3rd day, March 25th, the Hilaria, rejoicing took place, the resurrection of the god Attis. A spring equinox, death and 3-day resurrection festival that predates the Gospels. And just to put the nail on the coffin of dating this festival before Easter was a thing, Marcus Aurelius in 160 added a new day on the 27th of March called the Vatio, which means that at the very least, this festival was in its form sometime between 40 CE and 160 CE, which is both before any widespread knowledge of the Gospels among Roman intelligentsia or any widespread observance of Easter. Did the Easter story about Jesus really happen the same way it's written in the Gospels? Stay tuned. You have just attained true gnosis.